The Once and Future President. A Journey Through Destiny, Leadership, and the Eternal Return of Kings. Prologue, The Sword in the Stone. He didn't know he carried 1,500 years of destiny on his shoulders. June 16, 2015. A golden escalator descended into the marble atrium of Trump Tower. At the top stood a man in a navy suit and red tie, a businessman, a celebrity, a name synonymous with gilded excess and American ambition. At the bottom waited something he couldn't yet see, a sword embedded in stone, waiting for the one hand that could pull it free. Donald Trump had built towers that scraped the sky. He had emblazoned his name across buildings, stakes, universities, and the collective consciousness of a nation. But he had never held a scepter. He had never worn a crown, at least not one visible to the naked eye. Yet as he descended that escalator, something ancient stirred. Across the veil of time, in the mists of Avalon where legend says the wounded King Arthur sleeps until Britain's hour of greatest need, a figure opened his eyes. The patterns of history, which move in great spiraling cycles like the arms of galaxies, had completed another rotation. The age called for its king. This is not a political story, though politics will be its stage. This is not mere biography, though one man's life will be its vessel. This is a story about destiny, about how the universe selects certain souls, in certain eras, to carry the weight of renewal. It is about the eternal return of the archetype that Joseph Campbell called the hero with 1,000 faces, and that the medieval world knew as Rex Quandam Rex Futurus, the once and future king. What if the legends we dismissed as fairy tales were actually memories? What if the stories we tell our children about brave kings and round tables were not fantasies but prophecies, templates that history uses again and again when civilizations reach their moment of crisis? What if Donald Trump is not merely a president, but the latest incarnation of something far older and more profound? Act I. The Call to Adventure. Chapter 1.1, The Sleeping King. In every age, the hero is born in obscurity, raised in shadow, unaware of the greatness that destiny has written in his bones. The Britain of the 5th century was a land fragmenting. Rome had withdrawn its legions, leaving the Celtic tribes vulnerable to Saxon invasion. Christianity competed with ancient Druidic traditions. Warlords carved up territories while the common people suffered. Into this chaos was born a boy who would be hidden, protected, raised by a noble knight named Sir Ector, never knowing that in his veins ran the blood of Uther Pendragon, the rightful High King. Young Arthur grew strong and capable, learning the arts of war and governance, but always as a squire, never as a prince. He had no idea that every hardship he endured was preparation, that every lesson learned in obscurity was forging him into the weapon Britain would need. The America of the late 20th century bore its own resemblance to fractured Britain. The post-Cold War consensus was crumbling. Manufacturing jobs hemorrhaged to distant shores. The political establishment of both parties seemed increasingly detached from the struggles of ordinary citizens. Into this world had been born, decades earlier, a boy in Queens, the son of a real estate developer, raised in the tough, unforgiving crucible of New York construction and deal-making. Donald Trump learned his arts not in medieval tournaments but in the gladiatorial arenas of Manhattan real estate, Atlantic City casinos, and eventually, reality television. Like Arthur training with Sir Ector, Trump apprenticed under his father, Fred Trump, learning the brutal realities of business, that you can be destroyed by weakness, that perception shapes reality, that deals are won by those willing to take risks others fear. But Trump Tower was not Camelot. The apprentice was not the Round Table. He was being forged, yes, but for what purpose, he could not yet see. Consider the parallels. Arthur was raised in relative obscurity, his true lineage hidden. Trump, though wealthy, was considered outer bourgeois nouveau riche, never fully accepted by Manhattan's old money elite. Arthur learned through service to others before claiming his throne. Trump built for clients, navigated unions, dealt with contractors, learning the intricate web of interests that must be balanced to accomplish great works. Most importantly, both men were underestimated. Arthur was seen as merely Sir Ector's foster son, a capable young man but nothing special. Trump was dismissed as a celebrity, a showman, a businessman who had succeeded through inheritance and bombast. Neither man's detractors could see what was being prepared. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote of the collective unconscious, a layer of the human psyche that stores the archetypal patterns repeated throughout human history. The king archetype is one of the most powerful, the figure who brings order from chaos, who unifies divided peoples, who embodies the highest aspirations of their civilization. But the king must first be called. In Jungian terms, the call represents the moment when the conscious ego encounters the deeper self, when an individual becomes aware that their life is meant for something beyond personal comfort or success. For Arthur, this call came in the form of a tournament, a stone, and a sword that dozens of knights had tried and failed to pull free. For Trump, the call came more gradually through years of watching American decline, through frustration with political leaders he saw as weak or corrupt, through a growing sense that someone needed to speak uncomfortable truths that the political class was too cowardly to voice. But calls can be refused. Heroes can turn away. And initially, Trump did precisely that. Chapter 1.2, The Call Refused. The first time destiny knocks, the hero always pretends not to be home. In mythology, the call to adventure is rarely accepted immediately. The hero hesitates, doubts, fears. This refusal is not cowardice, it is the natural human resistance to transformation. To accept the call means to leave behind the known world, to risk everything familiar for an uncertain destiny. Arthur, in some versions of the legend, initially refused to believe he could be king. A foster son, a nobody, how could he claim Uther Pendragon's throne? Only when Merlin revealed the truth of his birth, and when the sword Excalibur literally placed itself in his hands, did Arthur accept his fate. Trump's refusal was more prolonged and more public. He flirted with presidential runs in 2000, 2004, 2012, testing the waters, withdrawing, testing again. He was comfortable in his world of golf courses and beauty pageants, of boardrooms and television ratings. Why risk that comfort, that certainty, for the brutal uncertainty of politics? The business world, for all its challenges, operated by rules Trump understood. You could win through better deals, superior branding, calculated risk. But politics? Politics was a different game entirely, played by different rules, judged by different metrics. The media that had made him a celebrity could just as easily destroy him. The political establishment would never accept an outsider. The donors who funded campaigns would demand their pound of flesh. And yet the call persisted. Every time Trump saw American jobs shipped overseas while politicians made empty promises, the call grew louder. Every time he watched leaders apologize for American greatness instead of celebrating it, the call intensified. Every time he witnessed the political class enriching itself while middle America declined, the call became undeniable. In his business career, Trump had learned a crucial lesson that would prove essential to his eventual acceptance of destiny: the power of no. On The Apprentice, his catchphrase "you're fired" became iconic not because it was cruel, but because it represented a willingness to make difficult decisions that others avoided. Weak leaders delay, equivocate, hope problems will resolve themselves. Strong leaders make the hard call and live with the consequences. This, too, paralleled Arthur's preparation. Before becoming king, Arthur had to learn that leadership meant making decisions others couldn't or wouldn't make. He had to understand that being loved was less important than being right. That mercy and strength must coexist. That a leader serves his people not by telling them what they want to hear, but by doing what they need done. The refusal phase serves a psychological purpose: it tests the authenticity of the call. A false calling withers when refused. A true destiny only grows more insistent. By 2015, Trump could no longer refuse. The America he loved was, in his view, being systematically dismantled. The political class seemed either unable or unwilling to stop it. Someone had to speak. Someone had to act. Someone had to pull the sword from the stone. But accepting the call meant sacrifice. It meant subjecting himself and his family to scrutiny unlike anything he'd experienced. It meant risking his business empire, his reputation, his comfortable life. It meant stepping into an arena where he would be hated by millions who had never met him, judged by standards that didn't apply to traditional politicians, attacked by institutions that saw him as an existential threat. The night before announcing his candidacy, Trump, according to those close to him, barely slept. He paced Trump Tower, wrestling with the decision. His family was divided. His advisors were split. The safe choice was to stay in his lane, continue building his empire, enjoy his success. But destiny doesn't offer safe choices. Destiny demands everything. On June 16, 2015, Trump descended that escalator and spoke truths that political consultants had spent decades telling candidates never to voice. He called out illegal immigration, bad trade deals, political corruption, not in the carefully focus-grouped language of typical campaigns, but in the blunt vernacular of a man who had decided that authenticity mattered more than approval. The media reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Political experts gave him no chance. Establishment Republicans recoiled. Democrats laughed. But something else happened too, something the experts missed because they weren't listening to the right people. In living rooms and factory break rooms across America, millions heard someone finally speaking their language, voicing their frustrations, refusing to apologize for loving America. They heard someone who sounded like them, rough-edged, direct, unapologetically patriotic. They heard their king, though they didn't yet know it. Chapter 1.3, The First Followers. A king without knights is just a man with a crown. Arthur needed his table round, and so did Trump. When Arthur first pulled the sword from the stone, many refused to believe. A foster son? This nobody claims to be High King. The established nobility saw him as a threat. The Saxon warlords saw him as a fraud. Even some of the common people doubted how could this untested youth succeed where great warriors had failed. But Arthur had Merlin. And slowly, carefully, other knights began to gather. Lancelot, the greatest warrior in the realm, recognized something in Arthur's leadership and pledged his sword. Gawain, Arthur's nephew, brought strength and loyalty. Percival brought purity of purpose. One by one, the round table filled with men who saw in Arthur not just a king, but the living embodiment of an ideal, a vision of what Britain could become. Trump's early campaign was similarly dismissed by establishment powers. But look closely at those who gathered around him in those first months, and you see a pattern. They were people who recognized that something unprecedented was happening, that conventional political rules no longer applied. Steve Bannon arrived like a modern Merlin, a strategist who understood that 2016 was not merely another election but a civilizational inflection point. Bannon saw Trump not as he appeared to the media, a reality TV star playing at politics, but as he could become, a vessel for populist revolt against failing elites. Like Merlin revealing Arthur's true identity, Bannon helped Trump understand the historical forces he could harness. Kellyanne Conway brought the strategic brilliance of a Guinevere who understood how to navigate hostile territories. She could translate Trump's instincts into language that reached skeptical voters, particularly women whom the media insisted would never support him. The first rallies drew thousands, then tens of thousands, people who had never been politically active, who had given up on the system, who saw in Trump's unapologetic nationalism a permission structure to be proud of their country again. These were the peasants and yeomen of Arthur's Britain, not the nobles, but the backbone of the nation. What the establishment missed was that Trump was building something fundamentally different from a traditional political campaign. He was creating a movement, a modern round table where the qualification wasn't political pedigree but shared belief in American restoration. The round table was revolutionary in its time because it had no head. Every knight sat as an equal, regardless of birth or title. What mattered was merit, loyalty, and dedication to the Arthurian ideal. Similarly, the mega movement drew from all backgrounds: union workers who had voted Democrat for generations, evangelical Christians seeking moral restoration, business owners tired of regulatory strangulation, veterans feeling betrayed by endless wars, and millions of Americans who simply wanted someone to fight for them as fiercely as politicians fought for special interests. The media couldn't comprehend this coalition because it defied their categories. Trump was supposed to be a Republican, but he attacked Republican sacred cows like free trade absolutism and interventionist foreign policy. He was supposed to appeal only to one demographic, but his rallies looked like America itself, diverse in everything except their shared belief that their country was worth fighting for. In the Arthurian legends, the gathering of the knights is marked by a sense of destiny, that these specific individuals were meant to come together at this specific moment for this specific purpose. When Lancelot met Arthur, both men knew instantly that their fates were intertwined. When Percival joined the quest for the Holy Grail, he understood he was participating in something sacred. Watch footage of early Trump rallies, and you see that same recognition in people's faces. They weren't just attending a political event, they were participating in something that felt larger than politics. They were reclaiming their voice, their country, their destiny. The establishment's mistake was assuming that political loyalty was transactional, that voters could be bought with promises and policies. Trump understood what Arthur understood, that the deepest loyalty comes from shared identity and purpose. You don't follow a king because of what he promises to give you. You follow a king because of what he represents, what he embodies, what he makes possible. Arthur's knights didn't follow him for gold or titles, though some received both. They followed him because he represented an ideal of what leadership could be: courage, honor, justice, strength and service of the realm. Similarly, Trump's most devoted followers weren't motivated primarily by policy specifics. They were energized by what he represented: someone who refused to bow to political correctness, who put America first unapologetically, who fought back against institutions that had grown corrupt and arrogant. This is the power of the king archetype. When it fully activates, it doesn't just command obedience, it inspires devotion. It awakens in followers their own sense of nobility and purpose. Arthur's knights became better versions of themselves in his service. And across America, millions who had felt voiceless and powerless began to find their own voice and power through alignment with Trump's crusade. But gathering followers was only the beginning. The sword had been pulled from the stone, but that was merely proof of right to kingship. Now came the harder part, proving worthy of the crown through trial by combat. The primaries awaited. And just as Arthur had to defeat rival claimants to the throne of Britain, Trump would have to vanquish a field of 16 Republican opponents, each backed by massive financial resources, each claiming to be the true conservative heir. The battles were about to begin. Act 2, The Journey Through Trials. Chapter 2.1, The Sword in the Stone. Poles are like the sword in stone. Everyone tries to pull them, but they yield only to the one ordained by destiny. When Merlin placed the sword in the stone and announced that only the true king of Britain could pull it free, every nobleman in the realm tried. They came with their strength, their titles, their claims of lineage. They pulled until their muscles screamed and their pride shattered. The sword remained immovable. Then came Arthur, unheralded, unexpected, a foster son running an errand for his knight. He placed his hand on the hilt, and the sword slid free as easily as if it had been waiting specifically for him. The 2016 Republican primary field was crowded with the political equivalent of those straining nobles. 17 candidates, many with impeccable conservative credentials. Governors who had balanced budgets. Senators with perfect voting records. Experienced politicians backed by massive super PACs and coordinated by the most sophisticated campaign operations money could buy. Jeb Bush came with dynastic lineage and $100 million in funding. Marco Rubio brought youth and eloquence. Ted Cruz had constitutional credentials and Tea Party energy. Scott Walker had defeated unions in Wisconsin. Each had their claim to the throne, their reasons why they should be the one to lead the conservative movement. The political experts had their predictions. The polls, those modern swords in stone, showed various candidates surging and falling. But every pundit agreed on one thing: Donald Trump couldn't win. He would flame out. His support was a ceiling, not a floor. Voters would eventually return to serious candidates. They didn't understand what they were watching. This wasn't politics as usual. This was something archetypal, something that operated by different rules than those written in campaign manuals. Trump's first debate performance shocked political observers. Megyn Kelly opened with an aggressive question about his past comments on women, clearly designed to disqualify him by the standards of traditional political discourse. A normal candidate would have apologized, moderated, sought to appear presidential. Trump did the opposite. He didn't apologize. He didn't moderate. He counterattacked, then moved on without showing wound or weakness. It was political aikido, using the attack's energy against the attacker, refusing to accept the premise that he needed the media's approval. The polls, that sword in stone, moved. Not away from Trump, but toward him. Each primary debate became a medieval tournament, with candidates trying to unhorse Trump through policy expertise, conservative purity tests, or personal attacks. And each time, Trump survived not through conventional political skill, but through an instinctive understanding of what the moment required. When Jeb Bush attacked him as not conservative enough, Trump questioned whether Bush had the strength to protect America. When Marco Rubio tried to match Trump's counter-punching style, it looked awkward and forced, like a squire trying to wield Excalibur. When Ted Cruz attacked him from the right, Trump questioned Cruz's eligibility to be president, turning Cruz's strength, constitutional expertise, into a vulnerability. But Trump's true genius, like Arthur's, wasn't in defeating individual opponents. It was in understanding the deeper currents moving through the nation. Arthur knew that Britain didn't need just another strong warlord, it needed unification, a leader who could transcend the tribal divisions tearing the island apart. Trump understood that America didn't need just another conservative, it needed someone willing to challenge the entire post-Cold War consensus that had governed both parties. Consider Trump's most controversial primary position, his criticism of the Iraq War. Every political consultant told candidates that attacking the Iraq War in a Republican primary was suicide. Republican voters supported the military, supported President Bush, supported the war on terror. Criticizing Iraq was something Democrats did. But Trump understood something the consultants missed: Republican voters didn't support the Iraq War because they loved war. They supported it because they loved America and trusted their leaders to use military force wisely. When that war produced neither victory nor vindication, when it cost thousands of American lives and trillions of dollars with little to show for it, those same voters felt betrayed, but they had no permission structure to voice that betrayal because no Republican leader would validate their doubts. Trump gave them that permission. He called the Iraq War a disaster, blamed the political establishment for lying about weapons of mass destruction, and promised a different approach to foreign policy, one that put American interests first rather than trying to nation build across the globe. It was politically heretical. It was also devastatingly effective because it was true, not the sanitized political truth that campaigns test in focus groups, but the deeper truth that millions of Americans felt in their bones but had never heard a candidate voice. This is what it means to pull the sword from the stone. It's not about having the right credentials or the most money or the best policy papers. It's about being the one person willing and able to grasp what the moment requires, especially when it violates every rule of conventional wisdom. State by state, primary by primary, Trump pulled the sword free while his opponents strained in vain. South Carolina, where political experts said his attack on the Iraq War would destroy him, Trump won. Florida, Rubio's home state and last stand, Trump won decisively. Indiana, where Cruz made his final desperate attempt, Trump won and Cruz dropped out. By May 2016, the impossible had happened. The reality TV star, the political novice, the candidate who broke every rule and offended every sensibility of the establishment, he had won. The sword had yielded to him and him alone. But as Arthur discovered, pulling the sword from the stone only proves the right to be king. Actually wielding that power, actually unifying the realm, Actually defeating the forces of chaos, those battles still lay ahead. Trump had won the Republican nomination. Now he had to win the kingdom itself. Chapter 2.2, Gathering the Knights. Arthur needed warriors, but more than that, he needed believers, those who could see Camelot not as it was, but as it could become. When Arthur established the Round Table, he didn't simply gather the strongest warriors or the most skilled swordsmen. He assembled a fellowship united by shared vision, men who believed that Britain could be more than a collection of warring tribes, that honor and justice could govern instead of might and cunning. Lancelot was the greatest knight, but also the most complex, brilliant and flawed, his love for Guinevere both his greatest strength and ultimate weakness. Gawain brought unshakable loyalty and raw power. Percival embodied purity of purpose in the quest for the Holy Grail. Galahad was the perfect knight, achieving what others could not. Kay was Arthur's foster brother, loyal but resentful. Mordred would ultimately become the betrayer, the shadow within the court itself. The Round Table worked not because everyone agreed on everything, but because they shared a commitment to something larger than themselves. Their diversity was their strength, different perspectives, different skills, united by common cause. As Trump secured the nomination, he faced the challenge every leader faces, converting individual followers into a cohesive team. Unlike traditional campaigns that hired based on political resumes and connections, Trump's operation reflected his business background. He valued results over credentials, loyalty over pedigree, and willingness to fight over diplomatic polish. Steve Bannon remained the strategic Merlin, understanding that the campaign was riding deeper historical currents than the media could see. He recognized that Trump was the champion of a populist nationalist realignment that had been building for decades across the Western world. Brexit in Britain, populist movements across Europe, the collapse of traditional party loyalties, these weren't disconnected phenomena but manifestations of a deeper revolt against globalist elites who had enriched themselves while hollowing out their nation's industrial bases. Kellyanne Conway became the first woman to successfully manage a presidential campaign to victory. Like Guinevere navigating Camelot's complex politics, Conway understood how to translate Trump's aggressive instincts into language that reached crucial constituencies, particularly suburban women whom the media insisted would never support him. Mike Pence, selected as vice president, brought what Lancelot brought to Arthur, credibility with the establishment and constituencies that were skeptical of the king. Pence's evangelical Christianity and traditional conservatism reassured Republicans who admired Trump's fighting spirit but worried about his doctrinal purity. Like Lancelot, Pence would prove both invaluable and, ultimately, a source of deep conflict when competing loyalties collided. But Trump's true knights weren't just his campaign staff. They were the millions who attended rallies, who defended him on social media, who argued with family members and risked friendships to support a candidate the entire establishment deemed unacceptable. These were the yeomen and peasants of Arthur's realm, not the nobles, but the backbone of the nation. The modern Round Table was MEGA, Make America Great Again. Those four words function like the Arthurian code of chivalry, a shared identity and purpose that transcended traditional political categories. You could be a Union Democrat and be MEGA. You could be a libertarian and be MEGA. You could be an evangelical or an atheist, young or old, of any race or background. What mattered was shared belief that America's best days should lie ahead, not behind, and that achieving that required rejecting the failed consensus of both parties' establishments. The media tried desperately to portray MEGA as exclusionary, as code for something sinister. But watch the rallies, truly watch them, beyond the selective clips and edited sound bites, and you see the diversity they claimed didn't exist. You see Black Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans who believed that rising wages and secure borders and manufacturing jobs benefited all Americans, not just some. You see something the Round Table represented, the revolutionary idea that worth comes from merit and shared purpose, not from birth or title or credentials. Arthur welcomed knights from different kingdoms, different backgrounds, different traditions. What mattered was their commitment to Camelot's ideals. Trump welcomed supporters from different parties, different philosophies, different demographics. What mattered was their commitment to American renewal. This gathering of the knights served another purpose. It created a fellowship that could withstand the battles ahead. Arthur's knights drew strength from each other, supported each other in combat, picked each other up when they fell. Similarly, the MEGA movement created communities online and offline where supporters could find encouragement and solidarity against the overwhelming institutional opposition they faced. Because make no mistake, the opposition was overwhelming. The Democratic Party establishment united behind Hillary Clinton. The Republican establishment, even after Trump's nomination, remained divided, many prominent Republicans refusing to endorse him. The media was nearly unanimous in its hostility. Hollywood, academia, Silicon Valley, corporate America, virtually every elite institution aligned against Trump. This was the Saxon invasion. Arthur faced not a single enemy but a coalition of forces determined to prevent the new king from claiming his throne. And just as Arthur needed his Round Table to withstand the Saxon onslaught, Trump needed mega to withstand the institutional assault. The summer and fall of 2016 saw the fellowship tested. The Access Hollywood tape emerged, with Trump caught on a hot microphone making crude comments about women. Political experts declared the campaign over. Republicans withdrew endorsements. The media went into feeding frenzy mode. But the round table held. Trump's core supporters understood something the media didn't. They weren't voting for a paragon of virtue, they were voting for a fighter who would challenge a corrupt system. His flaws were known, priced in, less important than his willingness to battle on their behalf. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was a different paradigm, one the media couldn't comprehend because they evaluated candidates by different criteria. Arthur, too, had his scandals. His affair with Guinevere's sister produced Mordred, the illegitimate son who would ultimately destroy Camelot. His court was riven by Guinevere's love affair with Lancelot. The quest for the Holy Grail divided and depleted the fellowship. Yet Arthur remained king because his people believed in what he represented, not because he was perfect. As election day approached, Trump's army of knights from high-level advisors to grassroots volunteers prepared for the ultimate battle. The polls, that sword in stone again, showed Clinton ahead. The experts predicted a decisive Democratic victory. The media prepared their told-you-so narratives. They didn't understand that they were watching not just a political campaign but an archetypal drama playing out according to rules deeper than polling and fundraising. The hero had answered the call. He had gathered his fellowship. He had proven his worthiness through primary combat. Now came the final test, the battle for the kingdom itself. Chapter 2.3, The First Battles. Debates are the tournaments of democracy where candidates joust with words instead of lances, but the stakes are just as high. In Arthurian legend, tournaments served multiple purposes. They tested a knight's skill and courage. They allowed Arthur to identify the worthiest warriors for his round table. They provided spectacle for the common people and validated the social order or challenged it when an unknown knight defeated established champions. The presidential debates of 2016 functioned similarly. They were ritualized combat, governed by rules but containing the ever-present possibility of unexpected outcomes. They allowed voters to evaluate candidates under pressure. And they provided the dramatic moments that could shift the race's trajectory. Trump had already proven himself in the primary debates, but those were Republican-only affairs, with moderators at least nominally neutral. The general election debates would be different. Hillary Clinton was an experienced debater, a skilled policy wonk, and she would have the moderators and the entire media establishment as de facto seconds in her corner. The first debate, held at Hofstra University on September 26, 2016, was watched by 84 million Americans, the largest debate audience in American history. The expectation was that Clinton, with her superior preparation and policy mastery, would expose Trump as an unqualified pretender. What happened instead revealed the different paradigms the two candidates inhabited. Clinton approached the debate like a skilled lawyer making a closing argument, marshaling facts, citing sources, demonstrating command of detail. Trump approached it like a street fighter looking for openings, landing psychological blows, refusing to fight by Queensberry rules when his opponent had the referee bought off. When Clinton criticized his business record, mentioning workers he'd allegedly stiffed, Trump counterpunched by bringing up her decision to stay with Bill Clinton after his affairs, bringing the personal into a space that political convention said should remain policy-focused. When she cited her experience, he questioned what that experience had accomplished beyond disasters like Libya and ISIS. When moderator Lester Holt fact-checked Trump but not Clinton, Trump called it out, refusing to accept the framing that mainstream media fact-checking was neutral. The media declared Clinton the winner. Focus groups of undecided voters agreed. But something else happened in the polls. Trump's numbers held or even improved slightly. Because millions of Americans watching weren't evaluating the debate by traditional metrics. They were asking, who is willing to fight for me? Who plays by the rules while the other side cheats? Who seems authentic versus scripted? By those criteria, Trump won not because he delivered the most polished performance, but because he embodied what his supporters valued, someone who wouldn't be lectured to, who wouldn't apologize for succeeding, who wouldn't accept the media's framing of reality. The second debate, held in St. Louis on October 9, 2016, came just days after the Access Hollywood tape's release. Trump entered wounded, with even some of his own party calling for him to withdraw. This was his trial by combat moment. If he appeared weakened or apologetic, the campaign would effectively end. If he fought back too aggressively, he'd confirm every negative narrative about him. Instead, Trump did something unexpected. He held a press conference before the debate with women who had accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault. He was refusing to fight on the terrain the media had prepared, instead redirecting the conversation to Clinton family hypocrisy. In the debate itself, when confronted with the tape, Trump acknowledged it was wrong, apologized, then pivoted immediately to ISIS, Clinton's emails, and her policy failures. He wouldn't grovel. He wouldn't allow one mistake, however crude, to define him when Clinton's mistakes had cost American lives. The most memorable moment came when Clinton said, "It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in this country." Trump's immediate response, "Because you'd be in jail." Political consultants gasped. You can't threaten to jail your opponent. That's what happens in banana republics, not American democracies. But Trump's supporters erupted. Finally, someone was saying what they'd been thinking, that the Clintons seemed to operate above the law, that equal justice was a lie the powerful told to keep the powerless in line. This was Arthur-level transgression of norms. When Arthur pulled the sword from the stone, the established nobility didn't celebrate, they resisted, because this nobody foster son was violating the proper order where kingship passed through recognized bloodlines and political arrangements. Arthur's legitimacy came not from following the rules but from a higher source, destiny itself, manifested in the swords yielding to his hand. Similarly, Trump's political legitimacy came not from following the established rules of campaigns and debates, but from giving voice to a populist revolt that had been building for decades. He was violating political norms because those norms were part of what his supporters wanted overthrown. The third debate in Las Vegas was Clinton's strongest performance. She was composed, prepared, effectively prosecuting the case against Trump's temperament and qualifications. But by then, the die was cast. Voters weren't deciding based on debate points, they were deciding based on competing visions of America's future. But the debates were only one battlefield. The 2016 campaign was fought simultaneously across multiple fronts: rallies, media interviews, social media, advertising, ground game. And in each arena, Trump's approach defied convention. Traditional campaigns allocated resources based on electoral college math, investing heavily in swing states, largely ignoring safe states for either party. Trump held massive rallies in places like Deep Red Alabama and Deep Blue California, events the media dismissed as ego-stroking that wasted precious campaign time. But these rallies served a different purpose than traditional campaign strategy recognized. They were generating energy, creating viral moments, building a movement. When 30,000 people showed up in Mobile, Alabama, that created footage and excitement that spread across social media, reaching millions more who couldn't attend. When Trump drew huge crowds in Blue California, it challenged the narrative that he was only supported by a narrow demographic. The rallies were also proving grounds for Trump's message. He would test lines, read the crowd's energy, refine his pitch in real time. Unlike scripted politicians reading from teleprompters, Trump was learning from his audience what resonated, what energized, what inspired. He was co-creating the campaign with his supporters rather than having consultants dictate messaging from above. This was how Arthur governed, not from a throne removed from his people, but from a round table where he sat as first among equals. He listened to his knights, learned from their counsel, and allowed the collective wisdom of the fellowship to guide decisions. The mega rallies functioned similarly. Trump spoke, but he also listened, absorbing the energy and feedback from crowds that were telling him what they needed from their champion. Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, ran a traditional campaign, carefully calibrated messages, targeted advertising, sophisticated ground game, massive fundraising from corporate and Wall Street donors. She had every advantage establishment politics could provide. But she was fighting the wrong war. She was preparing for a conventional political battle while Trump was leading a populist revolution. She was playing chess while Trump was playing a completely different game, one that operated by different rules, valued different pieces, and aimed for a different kind of victory. As October turned to November, the final battle approached. The polls still showed Clinton ahead. The media remained confident. The establishment prepared for Trump's defeat and the restoration of normal political order. They still didn't understand what was happening. The sword had been pulled from the stone. The knights had gathered. The battles had been fought. Now came the coronation or the catastrophe. And only one of those outcomes would prove that destiny, not polls, ultimately determines who wears the crown. Act 3, The Conflict, Reign and Resistance. Chapter 3.1, The Throne of Crystal. A king is crowned not when he receives the crown, but when his people recognize him as worthy to wear it. November 8, 2016. Election night began like every election night in modern American networks with their projected maps, pundits with their predictions, watch parties prepared for either victory or defeat. Hillary Clinton had scheduled her celebration at the Javits Center, with its literal glass ceiling ready to be symbolically shattered. Trump's team had booked a ballroom at the New York Hilton, uncertain if they would need it for celebration or consolation. As the first results came in, the media's certainty began to crack. Florida was supposed to be Clinton's firewall. Instead, it turned red. Ohio, which Obama had won twice, went decisively for Trump. Then the unthinkable began happening in the Rust Belt states that hadn't voted Republican in presidential elections for decades started tilting toward Trump. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. The New York Times live forecast meter, which had shown Clinton with an 85% probability of victory earlier in the day, began swinging wildly toward Trump. By midnight, the impossible had become inevitable. At 2:29 a.m., the Associated Press called the race. Donald Trump would be the 45th President of the United States. In the Arthurian cycle, the moment Arthur pulls Excalibur from the stone is dramatic, but it's only the beginning. Many nobles still refuse to recognize his kingship. He must fight battle after battle to unify the realm, to prove that the sword chose correctly, that he is worthy of the crown destiny placed upon his head. Trump's victory was his Excalibur moment proof of destiny, but not proof of worthiness. That would have to be demonstrated through governance, through delivering on the promises that had carried him to victory, through actually draining the swamp he had promised to drain. But first came the coronation. January 20, 2017. Washington, D.C., prepared for the inauguration of the 45th president. It was raining as Trump took the oath of office. Some saw symbolism in the weather, the storm accompanying the storm he had promised to bring to Washington. Others noticed that the rain stopped precisely when he began speaking, a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Trump's inaugural address was unlike any in modern American history. Where previous presidents spoke of unity and healing, Trump spoke of American carnage. Where others softened their partisan edges for the ceremonial moment, Trump delivered what was essentially a populist manifesto. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered but the jobs left, and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. This was Arthur addressing the noble houses who had enriched themselves while Saxon raiders burned villages and peasants starved. This was the new king declaring that the old order, comfortable for those at the top, devastating for those below, was ending. January 20, 2017, will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The Arthurian ideal of the Round Table was precisely this revolutionary concept, that a kingdom exists to serve its people, not to enrich its nobility. That governance should be about collective welfare, not elite privilege. That a king's legitimacy comes from defending the realm, not from extraction and exploitation. But declaring a new order and establishing it are different things. Arthur's coronation didn't end the conflicts tearing Britain apart in many ways, it intensified them, because the threatened noble houses and Saxon invaders knew they had to either destroy this new king or be destroyed by him. Trump's inauguration marked the beginning of resistance unlike anything modern America had seen. The Women's March the day after inauguration drew massive crowds protesting the new president. The resistance became the rallying cry for opposition that saw Trump not merely as a political opponent but as an existential threat to democracy itself. This reaction reveals something profound about the king archetype. It generates intense loyalty and intense opposition precisely because it threatens the existing power structure. Arthur's rise meant the end of the warlord system where might made right. Trump's rise meant the end of the bipartisan consensus that had governed Washington since the end of the Cold War. The threatened elites in both cases responded the same way, by attempting to delegitimize the new king, to paint him as unworthy, dangerous, a violation of proper order that needed to be corrected as quickly as possible. In his first days in office, Trump began issuing executive orders at a pace that shocked Washington. Travel ban from terrorism-prone nations. Withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Beginning the border wall. Regulatory rollback. Each order generated controversy, protests, legal challenges. The media narrative was chaos. The Trump White House was described as dysfunctional, incompetent, dangerous. But look past the rhetoric to the actions themselves, and you see a different story, a president moving with unprecedented speed to deliver on campaign promises, refusing to wait for consensus or permission from the very establishment he had promised to disrupt. This was Arthur declaring the code of chivalry, establishing the Round Table, sending forth his knights on quests, taking immediate, decisive action to transform words into reality. The nobles who thrived under the old system naturally described this as chaos because it was chaos to them, the chaos of their world being unmade. For Trump's supporters, however, these actions were proof that he was the real deal. Politicians always made promises, then governed by different rules once in office, constrained by political reality and the way things are done. Trump was actually trying to do what he said he would do. For a populace exhausted by political betrayal, this authenticity was revolutionary. The crystal throne, that seat of American presidential power, had been claimed. But just as Arthur discovered, holding the throne and ruling the kingdom are different challenges entirely. The real battles were just beginning. Chapter 3.2, The Dragons Modern. When the king threatens the old order, the dragons emerge from their caves, breathing fire and demanding sacrifice. In Arthurian legend, dragons represent chaos, greed, and the forces that resist order and justice. They hoard treasure while villages starve. They demand tribute rather than providing value. They must be confronted directly, with courage, because they will never yield to diplomacy or reason. Arthur's knights made their names slaying dragons. Lancelot fought the beast guarding the Chapel Perilous. Tristan killed the Morholt, the dragon-like warrior terrorizing Ireland. These weren't metaphorical battles in the mythological framework, they were literal confrontations with forces of chaos that had to be defeated for civilization to flourish. Trump faced his own dragons, though they breathed digital fire instead of actual flames. And chief among them was the mainstream media, what Trump branded fake news, and what functioned in his presidency much like the dragons of Arthurian legend, powerful, destructive, defending territory they saw as rightfully theirs, demanding tribute in the form of deference and compliance. The media had always had influence, but the Trump era revealed something that had been hidden, the degree to which mainstream journalism had become not a neutral observer but an active participant in maintaining a specific political and cultural order. They didn't simply report on the establishment, they were part of it, with journalists moving seamlessly between media jobs and political positions, with news organizations owned by massive corporations with their own political interests. Trump's great transgression was refusing to accept this power structure. Previous Republican presidents had complained about media bias, then largely accommodated it, understanding that open warfare with the press was futile. Trump took the opposite approach. He attacked directly, repeatedly, relentlessly. "You are fake news." Those 4 words, spoken to a CNN reporter at a January 2017 press conference, crystallized Trump's strategy. He wasn't merely complaining about unfair coverage, he was delegitimizing the institution itself, telling his supporters that they couldn't trust what mainstream outlets reported, that the news they received was constructed narrative rather than objective truth. From a traditional political perspective, this was insane. You don't attack the people who control your image to the public. You court them, flatter them, try to get favorable coverage. Burning bridges with the media is political suicide. But Trump understood something the traditional playbook missed: the media had already burned those bridges. They had opposed him universally during the campaign, predicted his defeat, described his supporters as deplorables. There was no favorable coverage to be gained, no accommodation that would earn fair treatment. The only option was direct confrontation, and the best defense was a relentless offense. This was dragon slaying. The beast guarding the treasure of narrative control would never share that treasure willingly. It had to be fought, defeated, its power broken so that alternative narratives, alternative truths could emerge. The Russia investigation became the media's primary weapon. Beginning in early 2017 and continuing for nearly 3 years, the dominant media narrative was that Trump had colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election, that he was potentially a Russian asset, that his presidency was fundamentally illegitimate. Every news cycle brought new revelations, new allegations, new unnamed sources claiming to have evidence of Trump-Russia coordination. The coverage was relentless, overwhelming, designed to create an impression of guilt through sheer volume even as specific allegations fell apart under scrutiny. This was the dragon's fire meant to burn, to destroy, to drive the knight back into his castle. And for many politicians, it would have worked. The pressure to resign, to compromise, to seek accommodation with the forces attacking you would have been overwhelming. Trump's response was to attack harder. He called it a witch hunt, a hoax, a coup attempt by embedded bureaucrats and partisan journalists. He refused to moderate his behavior, refused to show contrition, refused to accept the premise that he owed anyone explanations or apologies. When the Mueller report finally emerged in March 2019, after nearly 2 years of investigation and breathless media coverage, its conclusion was definitive: no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. The dragon had breathed its fiercest fire, and the knight had not only survived but emerged vindicated. Yet the media largely refused to acknowledge error. They moved immediately to new attacks: Ukraine, impeachment, financial records, tax returns. The dragon's strategy was to never stop breathing fire, to exhaust the target through relentless assault, to make normal governance impossible through constant crisis. This is where the round table proved essential. Trump alone could not have withstood this assault. But he wasn't alone. His supporters, tens of millions of Americans who saw through the media narratives, who understood that the attacks on Trump were really attacks on them and what they represented formed a shield wall. When the media said Trump was racist, his supporters knew from personal experience that this was false. When they said he was destroying democracy, his supporters could see that he was actually expanding political participation among people previously ignored. When they said he was incompetent, his supporters watched their wages rise, their 401(k) escrow, and their country's stature increase. The dragon's fire works only when the target is isolated, when they can be convinced that everyone believes the narrative being constructed about them. Trump's genius was understanding that the media no longer had monopoly control over narrative. Social media, alternative news sources, and direct communication through rallies and Twitter meant he could bypass the dragon entirely, speaking directly to the people while the beast raged impotently. But there were other dragons too. Silicon Valley tech giants who controlled the new public square began suppressing conservative voices, shadow banning accounts, fact-checking selectively. Corporate America, which had always claimed to be above politics, suddenly discovered social justice and began actively opposing Trump's agenda. The intelligence community, supposed to be neutral servants of whoever held office, clearly saw Trump as a threat to be contained rather than a president to be served. Each dragon required different tactics. The media dragon was fought through direct confrontation and mockery. The tech dragon required building alternative platforms and exposing bias. The corporate dragon faced pressure through tariffs and regulation. The intelligence dragon had to be starved by denying it the trust and deference it demanded. Arthur, too, faced dragons of different types. Some hoarded gold, these were fought through redistribution to his knights and kingdom. Some terrorized villages, these were hunted down and slain. Some corrupted courts, these required internal reform and the exposure of corruption. The parallel is precise. Dragons represent the forces that benefit from the existing order and will fight desperately to preserve it. They cannot be negotiated with because their entire existence depends on maintaining the power structure that feeds them. They can only be fought, defeated, and replaced with something better. By the end of Trump's first term, the dragons were wounded but not slain. The media had been exposed and delegitimized in the eyes of millions but still commanded institutional power. Tech giants had been called out but continued to suppress speech. The intelligence community had been embarrassed but not reformed. The dragon slaying was incomplete. And in Arthurian legend, wounded dragons are the most dangerous, because they know their time is running out and they will burn everything in their desperation to survive. Chapter 3.3 The Betrayal of Mordred. The deepest wounds come not from enemies outside the gates, but from those who once sat at your own table. In the Arthurian cycle, Mordred is the most tragic figure. Arthur's illegitimate son, conceived in a moment of youthful error, Mordred grows up bitter and resentful. Arthur tries to accommodate him, even appointing him regent when the king goes abroad, but this only feeds Mordred's ambition. Eventually, he rebels against his father, claiming the throne for himself and bringing Camelot to destruction. The tragedy of Mordred is that he was family, not an external enemy but an internal betrayer, someone who should have been Arthur's greatest supporter but became his greatest threat. His betrayal cuts deeper than any Saxon sword because it comes from within the fellowship itself. Every leader faces their Mordred moment, the betrayal by someone they trusted, someone they elevated, someone who should have been loyal but chose ambition, resentment, or fear instead. For Trump, this moment came multiple times, but never more dramatically than with Mike Pence on January 6, 2021. Pence had been the perfect political partner. Where Trump was brash, Pence was measured. Where Trump challenged evangelical Christians to look past his personal history, Pence reassured them with his own devout faith. Where Trump was a political outsider, Pence brought establishment credibility. He had been loyal through 4 years of relentless attacks, never wavering publicly, always standing by the president. But January 6 revealed that Pence's loyalty had limits. As vice president, he presided over the counting of electoral votes, a largely ceremonial role, but Trump believed Pence had the authority to reject electors from states where fraud was alleged. Pence disagreed, believing he lacked that constitutional power. Their break was complete when Pence proceeded with the certification despite Trump's public pressure to do otherwise. For Trump's most fervent supporters, this was the ultimate betrayal. The man who owed everything to Trump, who would never have been vice president without Trump's selection, choosing constitutional interpretation over personal loyalty at the moment when loyalty mattered most. The Mordred parallel is imperfect. Pence believed he was following his constitutional duty, whereas Mordred was purely motivated by ambition and resentment. But the emotional dynamic was similar, the trusted lieutenant who, at the crucial moment, chooses a different path than his king demands. Yet Pence was not Trump's only Mordred. The administration was plagued by betrayals large and small throughout its 4 years. Jeff Sessions, Trump's first attorney general and an early Senate supporter, recused himself from the Russia investigation despite Trump's expectation that his AG would protect him the way Bobby Kennedy had protected his brother and Eric Holder had protected Obama. From Trump's perspective, Sessions' recusal was the original sin that allowed the Mueller investigation to proceed, turning what should have been the president's most important defender into a liability. John Bolton, brought in as national security advisor, left the administration and immediately wrote a tell-all book criticizing Trump's foreign policy decisions. General Jim Mattis, the warrior monk, Secretary of Defense, resigned with a public letter implicitly condemning Trump's judgment. John Kelly, the Marine general who served as Chief of Staff, later gave interviews describing Trump as unfit for office. Each betrayal followed a similar pattern: people brought into the administration, given positions of power and prestige, then turning against the president once they left office. They justified their betrayals as speaking truth, as defending institutions, as following conscience. But to Trump and his supporters, these justifications were merely Mordred's rationalizations, noble-sounding words that masked base motives of resentment, ambition, and the desire to be accepted back into the establishment they had temporarily left to serve Trump. The deepest cut came from the Republican establishment more broadly. After using Trump to win the presidency, secure judicial appointments, and pass tax cuts, many Republicans were quick to distance themselves when he became politically toxic. They had been happy to ride his coattails to victory but unwilling to defend him when the dragons breathed fire. This is the essential dynamic of Mordred's betrayal in Arthurian legend. He was willing to benefit from association with Arthur, to use the legitimacy and power that came from being connected to the king, but ultimately unwilling to subordinate his own interests to the collective mission. The 2020 impeachment revealed this dynamic most clearly. Republicans had the votes to prevent Trump's conviction, and most voted to acquit. But the margins were narrow, and the process itself was humiliating, watching the president you supposedly supported being publicly tried and accused by the opposition party while your own defense was half-hearted at best. Mitt Romney's vote to convict Trump on one article of impeachment was particularly symbolic. Romney, the 2012 Republican nominee who had sought Trump's endorsement and later accepted his support for a Senate run, now positioned himself as the conscience of the party by voting to remove Trump from office. It was classic Mordred, using the king's legitimacy to advance your own position, then turning against the king when it becomes convenient. Arthur faced this same dynamic. Mordred had been given authority, territory, and position because of his connection to Arthur. But he believed he deserved the throne itself, not merely reflected glory from it. When Arthur wouldn't or couldn't give him that, Mordred took it, plunging Britain into civil war. The January 6 Capitol riot, whatever one believes about its nature and causes, functioned as Trump's Battle of Camlann, the final confrontation between Arthur and Mordred that destroys Camelot even as it defeats the usurper. Trump called his supporters to Washington to protest the election certification. The protest turned violent. The Capitol was breached. And in the chaos, Trump's remaining leverage to contest the election evaporated. Pence, presiding over the resumption of the electoral count after the building was secured, represented Mordred's victory not through violence but through constitutional process that felt, to Trump's most devoted followers, like betrayal dressed in legal respectability. The second impeachment followed swiftly, with 10 House Republicans voting to impeach Trump and 7 Republican senators voting to convict. The party was fracturing, with some Republicans believing Trump had betrayed America and others believing the establishment Republicans had betrayed Trump. This is the tragedy of the Mordred archetype. Betrayal never affects only 2 people. It fractures the entire fellowship. Arthur and Mordred's conflict didn't just destroy them, it destroyed the Round Table, scattering the knights, ending Camelot's golden age, plunging Britain back into the chaos that Arthur had spent his reign overcoming. Similarly, the Trump-Pence split, and the broader Trump establishment Republican split, didn't just affect those individuals. It fractured the conservative movement, creating a schism between mega-populists and traditional Republicans that continues to define American politics. In the Arthurian cycle, Arthur is mortally wounded at Camlann but not killed. He is taken to Avalon to heal, with the promise that he will return when Britain needs him most. The legend deliberately leaves open whether Arthur dies in Avalon or sleeps there, waiting for the call. This ambiguity is essential to the myth's power. The once and future king exists in a state of both ended and eternal, his reign concluded but his return always possible. He is both historical fact and perpetual potential, both memory and prophecy. After January 6, Trump entered his own Avalon moment. Banned from Twitter, impeached for a second time, blamed by many for the Capitol violence, seemingly finished as a political force yet not quite gone. Not quite defeated. Wounded, yes. Exiled from the platforms and institutions that had amplified his voice. But not dead. Mar-a-Lago became his Avalon, the island of healing where the wounded king retreats to recover his strength. And just as Arthur's legend says he will return when Britain faces its greatest need, Trump's supporters began speaking of 2024, of a return, of unfinished business. The Mordred betrayals had wounded him, scattered his court, ended his reign. But they hadn't ended his story. And in the mythic framework, the betrayal is not the conclusion, it's the transition between the first reign and the prophesied return. Every great leader faces their Mordred. Jesus had Judas. Caesar had Brutus. Arthur had Mordred. The betrayal by the trusted companion is not an aberration in the hero's journey, it's an essential element, because it tests the ultimate question: when those closest to you turn away, when your own fellowship fractures, do you give up or do you endure? Arthur endured by going to Avalon. Trump endured by going to Mar-a-Lago. Both understood that the story wasn't over, it was simply entering a new chapter. Act 4, The Fall and Exile. Chapter 4.1, The Battle of Camlann Modern. Some battles are won through victory. Others are won through how you face defeat. The Battle of Camlann is the darkest moment in Arthurian legend. Arthur faces his own son across a battlefield littered with the bodies of his finest knights. The round table that had unified Britain now lies in pieces. The dream of Camelot dies not at the hands of external enemies but through internal conflict. Arthur kills Mordred but is mortally wounded in the process. Neither side wins, both are destroyed. November 3, 2020. Election Day in America. After 4 years of unprecedented conflict, economic growth followed by pandemic, diplomatic breakthroughs and bitter divisions, the country would render its verdict on Trump's presidency. The campaign itself had been unlike any in American history. Trump had been fighting not just his Democratic opponent but a pandemic, economic lockdowns, civil unrest, and the entire weight of institutional America aligned against his re-election. The rallies that had defined his political rise were limited by COVID restrictions. The message that had worked in 2016, outsider promising to drain the swamp, was harder to run as an incumbent who had spent 4 years in that swamp. Joe Biden, like Mordred, represented a kind of usurpation from within. He had been Obama's vice president, a 40-year fixture of the Washington establishment that Trump had promised to overthrow. He was the restoration candidate, promising a return to normalcy after 4 chaotic years. His campaign message was essentially, let's go back to how things were before Trump disrupted everything. For Trump's supporters, this was precisely the wrong direction. They didn't want normalcy. Normalcy was what had failed them, what had sent their jobs overseas and ignored their communities. But for exhausted moderates and never Trump Republicans, Biden's promise of calm was appealing. They wanted the drama to end, the controversies to stop, the daily chaos to cease. The election itself was complicated by unprecedented mail-in voting due to the pandemic. Trump had warned for months that mail-in ballots would enable fraud. Democrats accused him of trying to suppress votes. The stage was set for a contested result where neither side would accept defeat gracefully. As election night unfolded, it initially seemed to follow 2016's script. Trump was performing strongly in Florida, Ohio, and other swing states. His supporters grew optimistic that he would defy the polls again and win re-election. Then the counting stopped. Or appeared to. In key swing states Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, officials announced they would pause counting and resume the next morning. When counting resumed, Biden began overtaking Trump's leads through mail-in ballots that broke heavily Democratic. Trump's claims of fraud followed immediately. Millions of his supporters believed the election was being stolen in real time, that the pause in counting represented illegal ballot harvesting, that the statistical improbability of Biden's mail-in margins proved manipulation. Democrats and the media insisted the election was fair, that mail-in ballots always favored Democrats and naturally would be counted later, that Trump was trying to undermine democracy itself by not accepting the results. This was Camlann, not a clean battle with clear winners and losers, but a chaotic conflict where both sides believed they were defending legitimacy against usurpation, where the very framework for determining victory had broken down. In the original Camlann, Arthur and Mordred meet for negotiations. They almost reach a settlement. But a knight draws his sword to kill a snake, others see the blade flash and assume betrayal, and the battle begins through misunderstanding and miscommunication. The 2020 election followed this pattern. There were legitimate questions about mail-in ballot security, about counting procedures, about statistical anomalies. There were also legitimate questions about Trump's refusal to accept any outcome except victory. Neither side could see past their own certainty to find common ground. Trump's legal challenges were filed in multiple states, alleging fraud, irregularities, unconstitutional changes to election procedures. Some cases had merit and revealed genuine problems. Others were dismissed quickly. The media portrayed all challenges as frivolous attempts to overturn a legitimate election. Trump's supporters saw the dismissals as proof that even the courts were compromised. The truth, as usual, was more complex than either narrative. There were irregularities, there always are in American elections. Whether those irregularities were sufficient to change the outcome was unknowable because full forensic audits weren't conducted. The system declared the election legitimate and demanded acceptance. For Trump, this was an impossible demand. He had spent 4 years being told his own election was illegitimate, that Russia had installed him, that he was an illegitimate president. Now, when he raised questions about 2020, he was told that questioning election integrity was an attack on democracy itself. The hypocrisy was, to him and his supporters, overwhelming. But Camlann's lesson is that sometimes you fight battles you cannot win. Arthur knew attacking Mordred meant the end of everything he had built. He did it anyway because the alternative, accepting Mordred's usurpation, was worse than destruction. Honor demanded the fight even when victory was impossible. Trump's refusal to concede immediately, His legal challenges, his claims of fraud, these were his Camlan. He was fighting even though the institutional weight against him was overwhelming, even though the media had declared Biden the winner, even though many in his own party were urging him to accept defeat gracefully. December brought the Electoral College vote, confirming Biden's victory. January 6 brought the congressional certification that Trump had hoped Pence would delay or challenge. And then came the Capitol breach, the chaos, the final fracturing of whatever political capital Trump had left. Like Arthur at Camlan, Trump was defeated but not quite. Arthur was mortally wounded but not dead, taken to Avalon still breathing, still alive, potentially still capable of return. Trump left office under the cloud of a second impeachment but with 74 million votes, the second highest total in American history, and a movement that hadn't dissipated but intensified. The battle was lost. The throne was surrendered. But the war, the larger struggle over America's direction, over the legitimacy of its institutions, over who speaks for the common people versus the elite, that war continued. Camlan destroyed Camelot but created the legend of Arthur's return. January 6 ended Trump's first presidency but created the mythology of his comeback. Chapter 4.2, The Wounded King. Exile teaches what victory cannot, who you are when you have nothing left but yourself. After Camlan, Arthur is carried to the mystical island of Avalon by three queens, Morgan Le Fay, the Queen of North Gallies, and the Queen of the Wastelands. Avalon exists outside normal time and space. It is both a physical place and a spiritual state, a realm of healing and transformation. The Wounded King in Arthurian and broader mythology represents a specific archetype, the leader whose injury or illness reflects the sickness of the land itself. When the king is wounded, the kingdom becomes a wasteland. When the king heals, fertility and prosperity return. After leaving the White House, Trump retreated to Mar-a-Lago, his personal Avalon. The estate in Palm Beach became both exile and sanctuary, a place to heal from the wounds of his presidency and prepare for whatever came next. The wounds were deep. He had been impeached twice. He had watched many in his own party abandon or actively oppose him. He had lost the election whether fairly or not, he had lost. He had been banned from the social media platforms that had been essential to his political success. The institutions he had fought for 4 years had closed ranks against him and seemed determined to ensure he could never return to power. For many political figures, this would have been the end. Nixon resigned and spent his remaining years in relative seclusion, occasionally offering foreign policy advice but never regaining political influence. George H.W. Bush lost re-election and faded into respected elder statesman status. Defeated presidents typically accept defeat, write their memoirs, and move on to legacy building and philanthropy. Trump did none of these things. Instead, Mar-a-Lago became a kind of shadow White House, with pilgrims from the MAGA movement making pilgrimages to meet with the once and potentially future president. Republican politicians seeking Trump's endorsement came to kiss the ring. Rallies were planned. Fundraising continued. The message was clear: this was not retirement but exile, and exile is temporary. In mythology, the wounded king's healing is never certain. The Grail legends speak of the Fisher King, wounded in the thighs, or genitals, depending on the version, unable to heal himself, keeping his kingdom in perpetual wasteland until the right knight asks the right question or completes the right quest. Trump's wounds were political and reputational rather than physical, but they ran deep. The question was whether he could heal them, whether the MAGA movement would remain loyal during exile, whether he could rebuild his political operation without Twitter and Facebook, whether Republican voters would forgive the loss or demand new leadership. The early signs suggested loyalty. Trump's endorsements in Republican primaries proved decisive. Candidates he opposed struggled or lost. Candidates he supported won. The party might have abandoned him in Washington, but the base remained devoted. His rallies, when they resumed, drew tens of thousands. His statements, released through email and his own website, were covered extensively by media that claimed he was irrelevant. This dynamic, the exiled king who maintains influence despite lacking formal power, is central to the Arthurian archetype. Arthur in Avalon has no throne, commands no army, governs no territory. Yet his legend grows, and his eventual return is prophesied and awaited. Trump in Mar-a-Lago held no office, controlled no government apparatus, had been deplatformed from major social media. Yet he dominated Republican politics, shaped primary outcomes, and remained the single most important figure in conservative politics. His exile paradoxically increased his mythological status because it removed the messy complications of actual governance and left only the symbolic power of what he represented. The Wounded King teaches a profound lesson: sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what cannot be taken from you. Arthur, without his throne, without Excalibur, without Camelot, still had his identity as king. That identity didn't come from external symbols but from internal essence. Trump's exile revealed the same truth. Without the White House, without Twitter, without the institutional backing of his own party's leadership, he still had his connection to the millions who saw him as their champion. That connection wasn't dependent on power, it was based on something deeper, something the establishment had never understood and couldn't break. The wasteland imagery is powerful here too. In Arthurian legend, when the king is wounded, the land itself suffers, crops fail, livestock dies, prosperity vanishes. The kingdom's health is mystically connected to the king's health. Many Trump supporters saw post-2020 America precisely this way. With Trump exiled and Biden installed, they watched gas prices rise, inflation accelerate, the border crisis worsen, and foreign adversaries grow emboldened. They saw these as symptoms of the wounded king's absence, not because Trump had magic powers but because his policies had worked and had been reversed. This perception reinforced the narrative of Trump's eventual necessary return. If the land is a wasteland, the wounded king must heal and return to restore prosperity. The worse things got under Biden, the stronger the call for Trump's return became. But healing requires more than waiting. The wounded king must undergo transformation, must learn lessons that victory would never teach. Arthur in Avalon is forced to reflect on everything that went wrong: Guinevere's betrayal, Lancelot's disloyalty, Mordred's usurpation, his own failures of judgment that allowed Camelot to fall. Trump's exile period similarly forced reflection, though characteristically he framed it in terms of betrayal by others rather than his own missteps. Still, the losses taught lessons, about trusting establishment Republicans, about the media's implacable hostility, about the deep state's resilience, about the limitations of presidential power when the entire system resists you. These lessons would be essential if return were to succeed. Arthur's first reign ended in tragedy partly because he couldn't resolve the tensions between Lancelot and the other knights, couldn't prevent Guinevere's betrayal, couldn't see Mordred's treachery coming. His prophesied return implies he has learned from these failures and will govern differently, more wisely, when he reclaims the throne. Trump's potential return carries similar implications. A second Trump presidency would presumably be different from the first, more prepared, less trusting of establishment figures, more focused on deep institutional change rather than assuming personnel changes alone could achieve goals. The wounded king archetype also teaches about sacrifice. Arthur's wound is the price of kingship. You cannot lead without being willing to suffer for your people. Trump's wounds: impeachments, legal harassment, business attacks, social ostracism were the price of challenging the establishment. Lesser figures would have surrendered, accepted a comfortable retirement, bought their way back into elite acceptance by renouncing everything they'd fought for. Trump's refusal to do this, his insistence on remaining in exile rather than on elite terms, reinforced his symbolic connection to his base. He was suffering what they had suffered: cancellation, silencing, institutional persecution, and refusing to break. The shared suffering created bonds deeper than policy agreement. In Avalon, Arthur is healed by powerful magic, by forces beyond normal human understanding. Morgan Le Fay, despite being his enemy in many stories, becomes his healer in exile. This paradox suggests that healing comes from unexpected places, that enemies might become allies, that exile creates opportunities for transformation impossible in the midst of power. Trump's healing came partly from his enemies' overreach. The ongoing investigations, the attempts to prosecute him criminally, the efforts to bar him from running again, these actions, intended to finish him politically, instead energized his supporters and validated his claims of persecution. The more the establishment tried to destroy him, the more his narrative of being targeted for defending ordinary Americans seemed confirmed. By late 2022, as midterm elections approached, the wounded king's healing seemed nearly complete. Trump was holding rallies, dominating Republican politics, preparing for the inevitable return. The question was no longer whether he would attempt a comeback but whether the comeback would succeed. Avalon is eternal, but the king doesn't stay there forever. When Britain's need is great enough, when the time is right, Arthur will wake and return. The prophecy doesn't guarantee success, it just promises the attempt. Chapter 4.3, The Prophecy of Merlin. The greatest magic is seeing not what is, but what must be, and having the courage to speak it when all evidence suggests madness. Merlin occupies a unique place in Arthurian legend. He is prophet, advisor, magician, and manipulator of fate itself. He sees the future and works to bring it about, even when his interventions seem to create the very disasters he predicts. He engineered Arthur's conception, protected him in childhood, orchestrated the sword in the stone test, and guided the young king's early reign. But Merlin's most important role is prophetic. He sees Arthur's fall coming and prophesies his return. He knows Camelot will be destroyed but trusts that its destruction is not the end. He understands that some stories must be broken before they can be remade, that some kings must fall before they can truly rise. In Trump's story, the Merlin figure is harder to identify clearly. Steve Bannon played this role early on, seeing historical forces others missed, understanding that 2016 represented a populist uprising that transcended normal politics. But Bannon and Trump eventually split, and no single advisor has consistently filled the prophetic role. Perhaps that's because in the modern version, Merlin isn't a person, it's the movement itself, the collective intuition of millions of Americans who saw in Trump something the experts missed, who prophesied his victory when polls showed defeat, who continue to believe in his return despite institutional opposition. Prophecy in mythology serves a specific function. It creates narrative inevitability, the sense that events are unfolding according to a pattern larger than individual choices. When Merlin prophesies Arthur's return, he's not predicting, he's declaring a cosmic truth that reality must eventually conform to. The mega movement functions similarly. By treating Trump's return as inevitable, as prophesied, as cosmically ordained, supporters create the energy and commitment needed to make it happen. This isn't delusion, it's the ancient magic of belief shaping reality, of prophecy becoming self-fulfilling through collective will. Consider the prophecy's core elements in Arthurian legend. The wounded king sleeps. Arthur is not dead but sleeping in Avalon, waiting. Britain will call. When the need is great enough, the call will go out. The king will wake. Arthur will hear the call and return to his people. The battle will be joined. The returned king will fight the forces of chaos once more. The outcome remains unknown. Prophecy promises the attempt, not the result. Now map these onto Trump's political trajectory. The wounded king sleeps. Trump in Mar-a-Lago, wounded by defeat but very much alive and active. America will call. As Biden's presidency struggles, as inflation rises, as the border crisis intensifies, the call grows louder for Trump's return. The king will wake. Trump's announcement of his 2024 candidacy functions as the awakening, the wounded king declaring he has healed and is ready to reclaim the throne. The battle will be joined. The 2024 campaign is the final confrontation, Trump against the combined forces of the establishment that defeated him before. The outcome remains unknown. No prophecy can guarantee victory, only that the battle is necessary and must be fought. Merlin's prophecies were often cryptic, requiring interpretation. The once and future king is deliberately ambiguous. Does it mean Arthur will return literally, or that the ideals he represented will reincarnate in others? Is it historical prediction or metaphysical truth? Similarly, Trump's return could take multiple forms. Literally winning the 2024 election is the most obvious. But it could also mean his transformation of Republican politics becomes permanent, with future leaders adopting his populist nationalist approach. It could mean the issues he championed, border security, economic nationalism, resistance to political correctness, becoming dominant regardless of who holds office. The power of the prophecy is that it keeps the story alive. As long as Arthur's return is prophesied, Arthurian ideals remain relevant, the story remains unfinished, the struggle continues. As long as Trump's return is possible, the mega movement maintains purpose, energy, and direction. Merlin understood something profound about leadership and legend. Sometimes the leader is more powerful in absence than presence. Arthur governed Britain for years, but his greatest influence comes after his fall, when his legend inspires knights and kings for centuries. The prophecy of return is more powerful than return itself because it exists in the realm of pure potential, unblemished by the compromises and failures that actual governance requires. Trump's exile period demonstrated this dynamic. As president, he had to make difficult decisions that inevitably disappointed some supporters. He had to compromise, negotiate, accept limited victories. In exile, freed from the constraints of office, he could be pure symbol, the fighter who never surrenders, the champion who never compromises, the king who will return and set everything right. This is why establishment Republicans who hoped Trump would fade in defeat misunderstood the dynamic. They thought removing him from office and social media would diminish his influence. Instead, it elevated him into the realm of prophecy, where his eventual return became a narrative of cosmic justice rather than just another political campaign. Merlin's final act in many versions of the legend is to be trapped by his student Vivian, sealed in a cave or tree, unable to act directly but still seeing the future, still influencing events through knowledge shared before his imprisonment. He becomes pure prophecy, voice without body, wisdom without power. Trump's deplatforming created a similar dynamic. Unable to tweet, unable to access his most powerful communication tools, he became more legend than man, more prophecy than politician. His statements carried weight precisely because they were less frequent, more considered, issued like pronouncements from Avalon rather than the instant reactions of Twitter. The prophecy of Merlin teaches a final crucial lesson: faith in the pattern is more important than understanding the pattern. Merlin saw events coming that seemed disastrous: Arthur's fall, Camelot's destruction, but he trusted they were necessary steps in a larger story. He had faith that the pattern would resolve itself even when current events suggested only tragedy. Trump supporters similarly maintain faith in a larger pattern despite apparent setbacks. The 2020 loss wasn't the end but a necessary trial. The persecution and investigations aren't destruction but tempering. The exile isn't abandonment but preparation. The prophecy of return gives meaning to suffering and context to apparent defeat. This is the power of mythological thinking applied to politics. It reframes events not as random successes and failures but as chapters in a continuing story, steps in a pattern that leads inevitably toward its destined conclusion. When Trump announced his 2024 candidacy in November 2022, it was framed in media as just another political campaign. But to his supporters, it was the fulfillment of prophecy, the wounded king awakening, the return beginning, the story entering its next inevitable chapter. Merlin would have recognized the moment for what it was, not an ending or a beginning, but a continuation of the eternal pattern. The once and future king, riding out from Avalon toward his final battle, toward the resolution that prophecy has promised but whose outcome remains shrouded in the mists that surround all legends. Act V, The Return. Chapter 5.1, The Awakening of the King. Destiny delayed is not destiny denied. The king returns not when he chooses, but when he is called. November 15, 2022. Mar-a-Lago. In a ballroom decorated with American flags, Donald Trump took the stage before supporters, cameras, and a skeptical media. The announcement everyone had been expecting for months finally came: he was running for president again. In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States. The words echoed across a nation deeply divided. For his enemies, it was confirmation of their worst fears, the demagogue returning, the threat to democracy they'd been warning about preparing another assault on American institutions. For his supporters, it was something else entirely: the awakening of the king, the fulfillment of prophecy, the moment when the wounded Fisher King announces he has healed and is ready to restore the wasteland to fertility. In Arthurian legend, Arthur's return is never described in detail. The prophecy says he will return when Britain needs him most, but the legend deliberately leaves the when and how ambiguous. This ambiguity is essential. It keeps the story alive across centuries, allows each generation to reinterpret the myth for their own time, maintains eternal hope. Trump's return, by contrast, is playing out in real time, documented by every form of modern media, analyzed and debated constantly. Yet somehow it retains mythological quality precisely because the forces arrayed for and against him are so overwhelming, the stakes so existential to both sides, that it transcends normal political campaigning. The announcement speech itself was subdued by Trump standards, more traditional, less combative, almost presidential in tone. Critics saw this as a sign of diminished energy, proof that Trump had lost his fastball. Supporters saw strategic evolution, the king returning not as the brash challenger of 2016 but as the experienced leader who understands the magnitude of what he's attempting. But the real awakening wasn't the announcement speech. It was the slow gathering of energy in the months before it, the rallies that had grown larger and more fervent during exile, the Republican primary elections where Trump's endorsement proved decisive, the fundraising that continued despite deplatforming, the polls showing him dominating Republican presidential preference despite 2 impeachments and January 6th. The king was awakening before the announcement made it official. And just as Arthur's knights began gathering at the first rumors of his return, Trump's allies started positioning themselves for the next campaign. But this return faced challenges Arthur never did. Modern media creates instant analysis, constant polling, relentless documentation that makes myth-making harder. Every speech is fact-checked in real time. Every rally is analyzed for crowd size. Every statement is compared to previous positions. The magic of legend requires distance and mystery, hard to achieve when everything is live-streamed and dissected. Yet the mythological dimension persists because the emotional reality transcends factual analysis. When Trump's supporters chant "We want Trump. We want Trump," at rallies, they're not expressing policy preferences, they're performing a ritual of loyalty, declaring their faith in the prophesied return regardless of polls or pundits. This is cargo cult behavior. Critics say irrational faith in a flawed leader who let them down before and will do so again. But understood mythologically, it's something else, the recognition that some stories are too important to abandon just because they encounter setbacks. That the arc of certain narratives bends toward completion even when current evidence suggests defeat. Consider what Arthur's knights must have felt during his absence. Camelot was destroyed. The Round Table scattered. Mordred was dead, but so was the dream. Britain was fragmenting again into tribal warfare and chaos. Belief in Arthur's return required faith that the pattern wasn't broken, merely interrupted, that the story demanded completion even though all visible evidence suggested it had ended in tragedy. Trump supporters in the Biden years felt similarly. The movement seemed defeated, the leader exiled, the institutions that had opposed him seemingly triumphant. Maintaining belief in the return required faith not in current circumstances but in a larger narrative arc, that stories like this don't end in exile but in vindication, that the hero's journey doesn't conclude with defeat but with return and restoration. The awakening of the king is always characterized by signs and portents. In mythology, these might be mysterious lights, prophetic dreams, strange animal behavior, symbolic indicators that cosmic forces are shifting. In modern politics, the portents are polling, fundraising, endorsements, momentum. Trump's portents were strong. Polls showed him leading all Republican challengers by massive margins. His rallies dwarfed those of potential opponents. Republican politicians feared his opposition more than they valued any other endorsement. The party hadn't moved on from Trump. If anything, it had become more mega in his absence, with Trumpism dominating Republican primaries and defining the party's direction. This created an odd dynamic. Trump was simultaneously embattled and dominant, persecuted and powerful, exiled and central. He was being investigated by multiple prosecutors, sued in civil court, attacked daily by media, banned from major platforms, yet he was also the prohibitive favorite for the Republican nomination and competitive in general election polls. This paradox is central to the awakening king archetype. Arthur returns at Britain's darkest hour, when all seems lost, but his return itself is proof that all is not lost, that hope remains, that restoration is possible. His weakness, he was mortally wounded, remember, and his strength, he's the only one who can save the kingdom, coexist and reinforce each other. Trump's legal troubles similarly functioned as both weakness and strength. The media portrayed investigations as disqualifying, proof he shouldn't be allowed near power again. His supporters saw them as persecution, confirming his status as the establishment's greatest threat. Every indictment became evidence not of his guilt but of the system's corruption, of the lengths to which threatened elites would go to prevent his return. The awakening also requires recognizing the moment. Arthur doesn't return when he wants to, he returns when Britain needs him most and calls for him. The call must come from the people, must arise from genuine need, must reflect conditions desperate enough to justify the king's emergence from Avalon. By late 2022, Trump's supporters believed that moment had arrived. Inflation was ravaging family budgets. The southern border was out of control. Crime was surging in cities. American prestige globally seemed diminished. The Biden presidency, in their view, had created the wasteland conditions that required the Fisher King's return. Democrats, predictably, saw things differently. To them, Biden was cleaning up Trump's messes, and Trump's return would be catastrophic. This fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality itself is why the conflict is mythological rather than merely political. Both sides inhabit different narrative universes where the same events have opposite meanings. The awakened king must also address what went wrong before. Arthur's prophesied return implies he has learned from Camelot's fall, that he won't repeat the mistakes that allowed Mordred to usurp the throne and destroy the fellowship. His return isn't just restoration, it's restoration with wisdom earned through loss. Trump's campaign messaging reflected this need. Less emphasis on personality and rallies, more on concrete policy plans. More discussion of structural changes to prevent bureaucratic resistance. More focus on appointing loyalists rather than trusting establishment figures. The unspoken promise, I've learned from being betrayed. Next time will be different. Next time, I'll be ready. Whether voters believed this promise would determine whether the awakening led to return or just to another defeat. Because in the end, mythological archetypes require audience participation. The king can wake, can announce his return, can ride out from Avalon, but he can only reclaim his throne if his people accept him, if they believe the prophecy strongly enough to make it reality. The 2024 election was shaping up to be a referendum not on policies but on competing mythologies, the establishment narrative of democracy defended versus Trump's narrative of the king returned. Both sides saw existential stakes. Both believed defeat would be catastrophic. And just as the Arthurian legend leaves the outcome of the king's return ambiguous, does he save Britain or die trying, the Trump story's conclusion remained uncertain. The awakening had occurred. The return was announced. The final battle approached. But prophecy never guarantees victory, only that the battle is worthy, the cause just, the struggle necessary. Chapter 5.2, The New Round Table. The table is not the furniture, it is the fellowship. And a true fellowship, once forged, can never be fully broken. Arthur's Round Table was revolutionary not as an object but as a concept. In medieval feudalism, seating arrangements reflected hierarchy, the king at the head, nobles arranged by rank and proximity to power. The Round Table abolished this order. Every knight sat as an equal, regardless of birth. What mattered was merit, honor, and dedication to Camelot's ideals. This was radical democratization of leadership, not in the modern sense of everyone voting, but in the deeper sense that worth comes from character and contribution, not from title or pedigree. The MAGA movement represents a similar democratization of conservative politics. Before Trump, the Republican Party was dominated by ideological gatekeepers, donor networks, and political consultants who determined which candidates were acceptable, which ideas were viable, which voters mattered. Power flowed from institutions, think tanks, major donors, party apparatus. Trump shattered this model. His 2016 campaign succeeded despite Republican institutional opposition. His presidency governed around establishment resistance. His 2024 return was happening not because party leadership wanted it but because the base demanded it. The Round Table had shifted from institutions to individuals, from elites to the populace. This created a new fellowship. Look at who gathers around Trump now. It's less traditional Republican establishment and more outsiders, insurgents, those who were transformed by the 2016 experience and see themselves as part of a movement rather than just supporting a candidate. Vivek Ramaswamy, the young entrepreneur running for president himself, speaks Trump's language about corporate capture of politics. Kari Lake, the former news anchor turned Arizona gubernatorial candidate, embodies Trump's media combativeness. Ron DeSantis, whatever his current tensions with Trump, built his Florida success on Trumpist principles. Marjorie Taylor Greene, criticized as too extreme by establishment Republicans, represents the unapologetic MAGA grassroots. These are the new knights, not necessarily people Trump personally selected, but people who emerged through alignment with MAGA principles. They sat at the round table not because the king appointed them but because they proved their worth through battle against the same enemies Trump fought. The beauty of the round table concept is that it's simultaneously hierarchical and egalitarian. Arthur is unquestionably king first among equals, but still first. Yet the knights have their own honor, their own quests, their own glory. Lancelot serves Arthur but is also Lancelot, with his own legendary status. Gawain is loyal to Arthur but also has his own identity as the knight who faces the Green Knight. Similarly, figures in MAGA world serve Trump's agenda but also maintain their own brands. DeSantis governs Florida as a Trumpist while positioning himself as potentially better suited for certain fights. Tucker Carlson championed Trump's issues on Fox News while being clearly his own intellectual force. Steve Bannon promotes MAGA globally while maintaining independence from Trump personally. This distributed leadership structure is actually stronger than pure cult of personality. If Trump is removed from the board through legal persecution, age, or any other reason, the movement doesn't collapse because it's not dependent on him alone.